Picture a soldier who hasn't slept in 2 days. His boots are soaked, his hands won't stop shaking, not from fear anymore, just cold, just exhaustion. Somewhere behind him, a truck engine cuts through the fog, and for 1 second, everything stops. Because that sound means something is coming. Not ammunition, not orders. Something better. Something that, for 3 minutes, will make the war disappear completely. It has no real name. Not one anyone will say out loud, anyway. Cooks called it by its official title. But the men in the trenches gave it a nickname so crude, so irreverent, that even 70 years later, people still laugh the first time they hear it. It was salty. It was cheap. It was, by every reasonable definition, an ugly plate of food. And yet, soldiers who survived the worst winters of the 20th century still talk about it. Not with disgust, with longing. Today, we're going back to a WWII field kitchen to find out how a scoop of dried beef and a slice of toast became one of the most beloved and most mocked meals in American military history. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a joke of a dish earned a permanent place in the hearts of the men who ate it. Welcome to Savoring History. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad you found this corner of the internet. This is Savoring History, the channel where we don't just read about the past, we cook it, plate by plate, war by war, decade by decade. Every dish has a story hiding inside it. And today's story starts in the mud of a World War II mess tent. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something. And I actually mean it. This isn't just a throwaway line. Drop a comment below and tell me what country and city you're watching from. I read every single one. And it genuinely makes my day to see this community stretch across the entire map. Some of you are watching this with your morning coffee. Some of you are watching it at 2 a.m. because you couldn't sleep. Either way, I'm glad you're here. And if this is the kind of content you want more of, real history told through food, without the boring textbook voice, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It's free. It takes 2 seconds. And it's genuinely the biggest way you help this channel keep going. A like on this video also tells me you want more videos like it. So if you're enjoying it so far, tap that button before you forget. All right, let's talk about the dish nobody wanted to say out loud, but everybody, eventually, learned to love. In 1944, the United States War Department published an official recipe for creamed dried beef on toast. The meal soldiers affectionately, and not so affectionately, nicknamed S.O.S. The original version wasn't written for a family dinner. It was written to feed 100 men at once, calling for about 7 pounds of dried beef, a pound of melted fat, flour, evaporated milk, water, and pepper. The method was almost military in its own simplicity. Shred the beef into small pieces, whisk melted fat with flour until smooth warm milk and water together. Then slowly combine everything while stirring constantly. Add the beef and pepper, bring it to a boil, then let it simmer for about 10 minutes before ladling it over toast. What's fascinating is how the measurements were written. Alongside pounds and gallons, old field manuals also measured ingredients in number 56 dippers. Because out in the field, nobody was carrying a kitchen scale. But almost every cook had that same standard quart-sized dipper. Some manuals even explained how to measure liquid, by how high it reached against the lettering stamped on the side of the can. It's a small detail, but it says everything about how resourceful and how improvised military cooking really was. And this dish is actually older than World War II itself. There's a version of it in a 1910 Army Cook's Manual, likely used during the First World War, that calls for parsley and real beef stock and uses nearly 4 ounces of beef per serving. By the time we get to the 1944 recipe, that number had dropped to just over 1 ounce per serving. That's not a change in taste. That's a war economy tightening its belt, one ration at a time. Less meat, more filler, and a lot more creativity asked of the cooks who had to make it taste like something. Now let's actually make it. Scaled down for a normal household, you'll need roughly half a pound of dried chipped beef, the kind that comes pressed thin, salty, and packed into small jars, weirdly reminiscent of a can of Pringles once it's unrolled. Add 2 tablespoons of butter. Older recipes from World War I specifically call for butter, so that's what we're using here too, though plenty of cooks in the field would have used whatever fat they had on hand. Bacon drippings included. You'll also need 1/3 of a cup of flour, 1.5 cups of evaporated milk, 1.5 cups of water, a teaspoon of black pepper, and a few slices of bread for toasting. Start by chopping the dried beef into small pieces and letting it soak in water for 15 to 20 minutes. This step matters more than it looks. Some of the older recipes say the beef was so aggressively salted that it needed to be scalded in boiling water just to be edible. Modern versions aren't nearly as harsh, but a short soak still softens the texture and pulls out some of that intensity. While that's soaking, gently warm the evaporated milk and water together in one pot over low heat. In a separate pot, melt the butter and whisk in the flour, letting it cook for about a minute. This is your roux, the base that's going to give the whole dish its body. Slowly pour in the warm milk mixture, stirring constantly so it doesn't clump, and let it thicken for 3 or 4 minutes. Season with the pepper, then stir in the drained, chopped beef. Bring everything to a boil, drop the heat down low, and let it simmer for about 10 more minutes. It'll thicken even further as it sits. Toast your bread until it's got a solid bite to it. You want it sturdy because it's about to get soaked. And ladle the beef mixture generously on top. The result genuinely surprised me. It's rich, salty, and comforting in a way that reminds me of a bacon gravy my own family used to make over biscuits. And if you want to take this recipe a step further, swapping the butter for bacon fat makes a noticeable difference. The toast underneath isn't just for show either. It's doing real structural work here, softening slightly under the sauce and balancing out a texture that, on its own, can lean a little chewy. If you want to play with it even more, ground sausage or crumbled bacon instead of the dried beef gives you a texture that's honestly more pleasant on the palate, while keeping that same comforting, savory backbone. Now, to really understand why this dish mattered so much, you have to understand what a soldier's kitchen actually looked like. Every company, somewhere between 150 and 200 men, had its own field kitchen, usually run by half a dozen cooks who could get the whole setup running in under 30 minutes, sometimes with a little help from the men they were feeding. Where that kitchen sat depended entirely on the terrain and how close the enemy was. Sometimes it was 100 yards from the fighting. Sometimes it was 10 miles back. If it was too close to the front, cooking had to happen entirely before sunrise and after sundown, so the smoke and the smell wouldn't give away a position. The farther back the kitchen sat, the safer the cooks were, and the more likely they were to combine forces with 2 or 3 other kitchens to feed an entire battalion at once. The centerpiece of every kitchen was the gasoline-powered M199-37 range. Compact, but versatile enough to work as both stovetop and oven. One training film from the war put it bluntly: if you lose your oven, take a couple of barrels, seal them with clay, and make your bread anyway. That's the mentality that field cooking demanded. Alongside the range sat large immersion heaters, capable of bringing a full barrel of water to a boil surprisingly fast, used for washing dishes, cooking, and occasionally, if anyone was lucky, a hot bath. There were also lister bags for purifying and distributing drinking water to up to 100 men at a time. And the now legendary Mermite cans, insulated containers, roughly 7 gallons each, built like an oversized thermos to keep food hot or cold on the long trip from the kitchen to the front line. There's a chilling detail buried in that last one. Some of those exact same cans, labeled for the European Theater of Operations, were also used to transport blood for battlefield transfusions. Grabbing the wrong one wasn't a mistake anyone made twice. Officially, soldiers had very little say in what actually landed on their plate. Starting around World War II, there was a real, deliberate push in Washington to scientifically calculate the perfect soldier's diet, with entire menus designed by nutritionists back home. Some of that thinking came from studying the enemy. American officials genuinely believed Japanese soldiers were pulling extraordinary energy from little more than a handful of rice, and that the Germans had access to a so-called Superman vitamin pill. That pill was real. It just wasn't vitamins. It was Pervitin, a methamphetamine-based stimulant that fueled soldiers through days without sleep, and that some historians argue made the speed of the Blitzkrieg possible in the first place. American nutritionists couldn't replicate that with supplements, but they still tried to build an ambitious diet on paper anyway. Dinner menus that could include chicken a la king, carrots lyonnaise, and upside-down pineapple cake for dessert, all shipped dried, salted, or otherwise preserved from the United States to front lines scattered across the entire world. In reality, supply lines rarely delivered any of it on time or in the right order, or sometimes at all. Field cooks were left improvising with whatever actually showed up, which meant the official menu and the actual dinner were often two very different things. Depending on where you were stationed, that improvisation could go surprisingly well. One corporal serving with the 10th Mountain Division in Italy in 1945 later described genuinely memorable meals put together by resourceful cooks working with almost nothing. But for most soldiers, especially anyone near the front, at least one meal a day, and for some, every meal, for days or even weeks at a stretch, came straight out of a packaged field ration instead. Between 1942 and 1945, the two most common of those rations were the C-ration and the K-ration. The C-ration packed 3 meals a day, each one built around what was called an M unit, the main meat dish, and a B unit, the bread and dessert portion. Early in the war, the M unit was almost always some version of stew: beef stew, canned meat, and vegetables. Later on, the variety expanded to include things like meat and spaghetti in tomato sauce, eggs and potatoes, or pork and beans. The B unit brought hardtack, supposedly softer and easier on the teeth than the version soldiers choked down in previous wars, made from soybeans, wheat, egg, and lard. Alongside it came coffee powder, or sometimes a lemon drink, sugar, salt, occasionally chocolate, and very often cigarettes and gum. All together, the 3 meals delivered somewhere around 3,700 to 3,800 calories a day, and could technically be eaten cold, though everyone agreed they were considerably better heated up. The K-ration told a different story. It was lighter, built specifically for paratroopers and men who needed to move fast, and it delivered roughly 2,130 calories a day, partly by design and partly because it simply contained less food. It was also, by most accounts, far less appetizing. Items like the infamous fatty pork loaf, along with maltose and dextrose energy tablets, were routinely thrown out by the very soldiers they were meant to sustain. The K-ration was designed to last no more than 5 days at a stretch. And yet, there are documented cases of entire units surviving on it for far longer than that. Merrill's marauders, fighting through the jungles of Burma, lived almost exclusively on K-rations for 5 months straight. After 5 months of fatty pork loafy, it's not hard to imagine exactly how a hot plate of creamed dried beef on toast would have looked to those men. Less like a joke, and a lot more like a small miracle. It's worth mentioning, too, that field rations from this era eventually evolved into something you've probably heard of, even if you've never served a day in your life. The modern MRE, or meal ready to eat. The shift from things like the C-ration and K-ration into what soldiers eat today is honestly a whole story on its own. One I'd genuinely love to dig into properly in a future video. Maybe even get someone who actually eats these vintage rations on camera to try the real things alongside me. If that's something you'd want to see, let me know in the comments, because I've already got a shopping list started. And speaking of things soldiers never expected to see on the front lines, one detail that always gets people is the U.S. Navy's ice cream barges from the Pacific Theater. These were essentially giant floating refrigerators, built specifically to produce and distribute ice cream to sailors stationed out at sea, at a cost that reportedly ran into the millions. It's a strange, almost absurd contrast next to a dish like S.O.S, proof that military food during this era ranged from the most utilitarian, salvage-everything cooking imaginable, all the way to genuinely extravagant morale-boosting efforts, sometimes within the very same branch of the military, in the very same war. But most soldiers weren't eating ice cream. Most of them, most days, were eating whatever the field kitchen could put together with what it actually had. And more often than people realize, that meant a big pot of creamed beef ladled over toast, eaten standing up, eaten fast, eaten because it was hot and because it was there. In the end, S.O.S tells us something bigger than any recipe ever could. Even the plainest, most utilitarian food becomes part of someone's memory when it's tied to survival, to cold mornings, to fear, to the simple relief of finally sitting down for 10 minutes. It's a dish born entirely out of scarcity, made from the cheapest cuts and the simplest pantry staples. And yet decades later, it still pulls a smile out of the men who ate it. Not because it was good, because of everything it meant in the moment it was served. If you have a grandparent, a family member, anyone who served in any war, this is your sign to sit down and actually ask them about it. Ask what they ate. Ask what they missed. Ask what they'd give anything to taste one more time. Sometimes it's the smallest details. The food, the smell of a mess tent, the sound of a truck pulling up in the fog, that tell you more about history than any book ever could, and more about the person telling you the story than you ever expected to learn. That's it for today's plate. If this story moved you even a little, let me know down in the comments. And don't forget to tell me where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe if you want more forgotten dishes with real history behind them, and I'll see you in the next one. This has been Savoring History.